So in our last video, we looked at how, as Paul says in Ephesians, Christ gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure, the stature, the fullness of Christ, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness in deceitful schemes. So here's a situation Paul says we naturally find ourselves in. We're tossed to and fro by the waves of life. We're carried about by every wind of doctrine, every different idea that sounds good, every different argument that seems to make sense in this crazy world. We're carried about by human cunning, right? Every plan devised by humans to get us to buy this or to invest in that. We're carried about by craftiness and deceitful schemes, right? Every system that offers hope and a future outside of God. In short, we naturally find ourselves in a mess. And it's this mess that every person is in apart from Christ. It's this mess that even having been united with Christ, we can be sucked back into. But as we've just read, the mess isn't the end of the story. God has a plan for his children in the midst of this mess. He has a plan to redeem it, so that we may no longer live lives tossed to and fro and carried about. God intends to build us up, he says. We're his hands and feet. We are his body. And he plans to build up his body until we attain the unity of the faith, until we attain the unity of the knowledge of the Son of God, until we, as his body, attain mature manhood, and until we attain the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Now, I don't have enough time to fully unpack all that entails, but in short, out of the mess, God's plan is to draw us together as his body, as his family, and to continually make us, through our relationships with one another, more and more like Christ. Every person in your life who is struggling with anxiety, he wants to draw them into his body and strengthen them, give them hope so that they may become more like Christ. Every person in your life who's battling addiction, he wants to draw them into his body and grow their self-control, give them hope so that they may become more like Christ. Every person in your life that's been abused physically, emotionally, sexually, spiritually, he wants to draw them into his body, show them deep empathy and comfort, give them real hope so that they may become more like Christ. Every person in your life who's depressed and weighed down by our happiness-obsessed, isolated culture, he wants to draw them into his body, teach them the joy of loving community, give them hope so that they may become more like Christ. But how? Right? How is God going to accomplish his purposes in the lives of all those people around you? Well, let's go back to our passage. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. Here's how God intends to bring about the purposes in his body through you speaking the truth in love to those he's placed in your life. Right? Just look at how Paul repeatedly emphasizes the fact that every single one of us are a part of his calling. He says, we grow into Christ's likeness from whom, he says, the whole body, which is held together by every joint. He says, and when each part is working properly, only then will the body truly grow. Because the whole body, he says, builds itself up in love. You are a key component designed by God in the building up of the brothers and sisters God has placed around you. And the brothers and sisters God's placed around you are key components designed by God in your building up as well. And the main way we're called to minister to, care for, and build one another up, he says, is through speaking the truth in love. As we're going to see, truthing in love. Every one of us is called to speak the truth in love to one another. This is how God intends to minister to his children in the midst of the mess. So, what do you call this kind of ministry? Right? If every single Christian is called to truth one another in love, where does that fall into our modern ministry vocabulary? Well, some people call it biblical counseling, right? Some people call it biblical discipleship. Some people call it mentoring. Some people call it coaching. Some people just call it friendship. And the truth is, it can take all those different forms. But as I've been saying, truthing one another in love isn't only a ministry for biblical counselors. It isn't only a ministry for mentors or disciplers either. It's a ministry for all of us. And I like to call this all of us ministry simply gospel care. And gospel care is what we're going to begin to explore in next week's videos as we dive into understanding the nature of this calling God has placed on all of our lives.